Hello students, welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Dr. Surya Prakash Upadhyay from Indian Institute of Technology, Mandi. Today we are going to talk on module Paradigms of Planning from the paper Sociology of Urban Transformations. So after completing this module, you will be able to develop an understanding of select urban planning paradigms in the Anglophone world. You'll also be able to trace the influences and the dominant frameworks that guide urban planning in contemporary India. After completing this module, you will be able to critically evaluate the contributions of planning paradigms to the present conditions of Indian cities. Indian cities are characterized by visual dissonance and stark juxtapositions of poverty and wealth. It often goes in a saying, whether in media or official and an everyday discourse, we often say, if only the city was properly planned. Yet, this invocation of city planning rarely harkens to the long-standing traditions of Indian urbanism. That is, the remarkable drainage networks and the urban accomplishments of the Indus Valley cities, the ghats of Varanasi, or the chowks and bazaars of Shahjahanabad. Instead, middle-class visions of the good city draw on a visual lexicon of spatial order and open space that derives from Western and often colonial models. This module, it examines modern planning paradigms that have influenced contemporary notions of the well-planned city. It first considers in detail a few key figures that have shaped popular and professional ideas about planning in the West. The other sections, they shift the gaze to the history of planning in India. Moving beyond the colonial legacy of Indian cities, we turn to the contributions of Scottish naturalist, sociologist, and urbanist Patrick Geddes. Subsequent sections analyze the ways in which Western models have been indigenized, focusing particularly on the careers of modernism and neighborhood unit concept in India. So let us look at some of the planning paradigms from the Anglophone world also. One of the most prominent paradigms was the garden city. It was first proposed by Ebenezer Howard in 1898. The garden city paradigm inaugurated the modern era in urban and regional planning. In Howard's conceptualization, the garden city represented a marriage between the most desirable amenities of the city and the countryside, allowing the cohabitation of urban economies with natural surroundings. The garden city was both a program for urban reform and a highly detailed physical plan. Howard's ideas arose in response to the circumstances of industrializing Britain, where economic changes brought by the Industrial Revolution brought a wave of low-skilled workers from a declining agrarian economy into the cities to look for work at the new factories. The resultant mass unemployment, poor quality housing, and overcrowding produced a public health disaster in British cities, famously described by Engels in The Condition of the Working Class in England. British agriculture was equally in crisis, with increasing concentration of production among a few proprietors and depletion of soils. It was at the confluence of these trends that Howard's ideas, shaped by prodigious reading, came together in the Garden City agenda. Emerging indirectly in response to the widely shared critique of industrial capitalism, triggered by the work of Marx and Engels, the Garden City was a comprehensive program for urban and agrarian reform. Radical revision of land ownership and property rights was a major component of these reforms. The Garden City was to be a systematically planned new town, but on greenfield, undeveloped and publicly owned land. The economic rent resulting from this inalienable tenure would accrue to the municipal government to pay for public services and social reform and social welfare. Two features of the Garden City framework paved the way for its future success. According to Batchelor, it was not so much the novelty of Howard's ideas as the attention of fiscal and administrative matters that distinguished the Garden City paradigm and expanded its appeal to business people. Interestingly, Howard's proposal included an early model for a public-private partnership. Equally important to the Garden City's subsequent mobility was the detailed physical plan that Howard created. The Garden City was to be arranged in a circular frame, divided by exactly 6 boulevards into wards for residential housing and amenities. At its center was to be a public park surrounded by public museums, libraries, theatres, hospitals and other public facilities. Each ward, housing about 5,000 people, was to be largely self-sufficient with a school and other civic facilities. On the outer limits would be an encircling Grand Avenue, an outer ring of factories, markets and other industrial and commercial activities. The Garden City was to be surrounded by an agricultural green belt with low population density to sustain the high quality of natural amenities and demarcate the city from the countryside. Ranked with the 20th century Le Corbusier and Frank Lloyd Wright as one of the most influential thinkers on the urban utopia, Ebenezer Howard continues to be the least known of the three. Yet, coinciding with a period of intense interest in city planning at the turn of the century, Howard's book, out in a second edition in 1902, was a runaway triumph, being translated into all major English European languages and swamping Garden City. Over the course of the century, however, Fishman argues that a Garden City model lost its intellectual power even as it gained adherents. He identified two discrete aspects of Garden City movement. One, the idea of decentralization, and two, the idea of self-contained communities. As Batchelor demonstrated, even in Letchworth, the earliest experiment of the Garden City movement, the basis of public ownership of land had to be given up at an early stage because the dividend limitations on joint company stock could not be sustained. This put into jeopardy one of the most important pillars of the Garden City movement as a political and economic program. The Garden City plan also continues to be popular among Indian planners, who dutifully encircle metropolitan master plans with green belts, and they are over time encroached by elite and underprivileged groups. It has also proved to be a durable template for the gated communities that have come to define India's urban landscape for the 21st century. As Menon suggests, the Garden City paradigm has traveled with ease across disparate cultural contexts because it has been decoupled from the political program of radical urban reform and economic transformation envisaged by Howard. This is both its success and its failure. Let us look at the neighbor units as a concept and a planning practice. So another planning paradigm that emerged in the early 20th century and proved highly adept in traveling across national and cultural boundaries was the neighborhood unit. Though the neighborhood has always been at the center of urban life in cities such as Paris, Venice or London, its importance as a planning unit in the West had come to be eclipsed by the 20th century. This is the backdrop of the invention or rather rescue of the neighborhood unit as a locus and instrument of spatial planning. The neighborhood had a life and history long preceding the neighborhood unit. Through his work, Parry installed it as the focus of the planner's remit. The neighborhood unit's genesis lay firmly within the preoccupation of 1920s United States planning cultures. Clarence Parry's ideas remained situated firmly within the traditions of the Chicago School of Urban Sociology and the work of authors such as Louis Wirth, Robert Park and Herbert Miller. Parry's contribution lay in giving a spatial scaffolding to the concerns of declining social capital and rising urban anomie that pervaded the work of these sociologists and in placing the neighborhood at the heart of urban design and rejuvenation. In designing the neighborhood unit concept, Clarence Perry employed his interest in physical planning in service of a program to restore and rejuvenate the connections between individual, family, and community. Residential zoning was central to the conception, as was a laid down configuration of streets to privilege pedestrian access. In all, 6 planning principles defined Clarence Perry's model of the neighborhood unit. 1. A size large enough to serve an elementary school. 2. Boundaries created through arterial streets to allow traffic to bypass the neighborhood. 3. Open spaces such as parks and recreational spaces. 4. Sitting of institutions such as the school to be close to the center of the unit. 5. Shopping districts, one or more, to be sited at traffic junctions and at junctions with adjacent neighborhood units. 6. An internal street system allowing adequate incoming traffic load but preventing bypass traffic. Starting a tentative concept in the late 1920s, Perry's ideas coalesced into a more rigid formula by 1939. In a book titled Housing for the Machine Age, he defined standards and principles for adoption in varying topographies by physical planners. 2 sets of criticism are especially relevant for the Indian incarnation of the neighborhood unit. 1. The neighborhood unit, with its strict planning parameters and rigid ideal of the good city, stood in stark contrast to Jane Jacobs' vision of organic, mixed-use and socially diverse neighborhoods. And indeed, social homogeneity was key to Perry's view of the neighborhood unit. Second, this understanding of neighborhood came under scrutiny not simply for the enforcing spatial standardization and homogenization, but also for creating boundaries between different neighborhoods with an emphasis on self-containment. In a sense, one can describe a city made up of neighborhood units as a sea of discrete islands. The neighborhood unit proved for a variety of reasons extremely popular among Indian planners, as we will discuss in the next few slides. If Ebenezer Howard pioneered the Garden City movement as a solution to the problem of the metropolis, the American urbanist and activist Jane Jacobs believed that diverse and dense cities needed no solution. In concluding her essay, The Kind of Problem a City Is, she made a startling but typically well-reasoned declaration. And it says, lively, diverse, intense cities contain the seeds of their own regeneration, with the energy enough to carry over for problems and needs outside themselves. In other words, Jane Jacobs argued that a city itself was a solution to the questions of economic vitality and social cohesion. Jane Jacobs' metropolis was mid-20th century New York City, where she lived for more than 3 decades. Her masterpiece, The Death and Life of Great American Cities, was written not as plan for building a new city from tabula rasa, but rather as a defense of the organized complexity of existing cities. The imperative for death and life came from a struggle to save the Greenwich Village neighborhood of Manhattan from the city redevelopment plan of powerful city bureaucrat Robert Moses. Moses' plan involved building a highway right through old Manhattan neighborhoods. Jacobs emerged as a passionate activist and advocate for the dense fabric of the already existing city against redevelopment that first destroyed and then reconstructed the remnants of long-standing communities. Jacobs thought to upend the conventional wisdom about what made for success in cities, and her work even forced a re-evaluation of the work of planning luminaries such as Ebenezer Howard and Le Corbusier. Her perspective on the role of parks and open spaces in the city illustrates the radical yet commonsensical quality of Jacobs' critique. Dotted with and surrounded by a green belt, Howard's green City aspired to bring the countryside into the city. Jacobs questioned the notion that open spaces were necessarily public or community spaces. Instead, she pointed that the parks in low density and low diversity areas could evolve into vacant spaces prone to antisocial or even criminal activity. But Jacobs did not simply issue a screed against public parks. Based on deep observation, she suggested a series of principles for revitalizing neighborhood parks, the first of which was that parks should not be too numerous so that they serve to concentrate rather than disperse the public life of the neighborhood. Unlike Howard, Jacobs valorized density and diversity as the very raison d'etre of the city. An empiricist committed to an inductive approach of drawing inferences from close observation, she proposed several practices for good urban planning design. One, she said, to regenerate exuberant diversity in a city's streets and districts, there are four conditions that are indispensable. One, the district and indeed as many of its internal parts as possible must serve more than one primary function, preferably not more than two. Second point that she makes that most blocks must be short, that is, streets and opportunities to turn corners must be frequent. The third point that she makes that the district must mingle buildings that vary in age and condition, including a good proportion of the old ones so that they vary in the economic yield they must produce. Lastly, she says that there must be a sufficiently dense concentration of people for whatever purposes they may be there. Therefore, Jacobs was a powerful proponent of mixed-use spaces and opponent of Euclidean zoning, a kind of widespread regulatory regime that attempted to segregate or keep apart residential, commercial, official, and other uses. Jacobs' activism and reasoned argument eventually defeated Robert Moses' assault on Manhattan neighborhoods, and her ideas enjoyed a wide sway over her lifetime. Her insights into the role and function of vibrant streets as well as socially and functionally mixed spaces were also important to the tenets of new urbanism. Over the last decade or two, her ideas have sparked regeneration and return from suburbs to inner cities. On the flip side, Jacobs' legacy has also become associated processes of gentrification, which have priced out older and poorer residents from central cities in the US. As the urbanist Sharon Jukin has argued in a balanced assessment of Jacobs' ideas, she says the self-guiding communities that Jacobs espoused have been submerged by elected officials who pay more attention to real estate developers than to community planners. She underestimated the strength of middle-class tastes for social homogeneity and aesthetic coherence that drive gentrification. So despite the immense relevance of Jacobs' ideas in tracing growth processes and the rise of informality in Indian cities, her works remain little explored in Indian context. One of the leading urban planning and design movements in contemporary American cities is New Urbanism, which builds on the work on Jane Jacobs. Also called Neo-Traditional Planning, this paradigm seeks to restore community revitalization to the heart of urban design. New urbanism can best be understood in contrast with and opposition to suburban development, which in the US has been inextricably tied with automobile dependent sprawl. Favoring cyclists and pedestrians over the automobile, new urbanism represents a focused critique of the system of automobile subsidies and zoning laws that narrow transit designed to privatize motorized forms of transport. Transit-oriented development, which integrates land use planning with transit line construction, is one of the key design principles of new urbanism. Associated principles include compact development that preserves farmland and environmentally sensitive areas. In a critical dissection of new urbanism's claim to community development, Tallinn outlines further elements of new urbanism's approach. 1. Architecture and site design. 2. Density and scale privileges. 3. Streets. 4. Public space. And 5. Mixed land use that is created in multi-purpose residential and commercial spaces and mixture of housing types to facilitate mingling across social classes. Described as the most important phenomenon to emerge in American architecture in the post-Cold War era, new urbanism has gathered adherents from the Congress for New Urbanism. Despite new urbanism's avowed concern for urban regeneration, Bohel notes that it has come to be associated with suburban development projects. Yet, new urbanism projects in inner cities and brownfield locations have equally come to be linked with process of gentrification that displace low-income, working-class, and ethnic minorities in a process of real estate development and value augmentation. Exploring this critique, Bohel notes that new urbanism involves an explicit focus on mixed income neighborhoods, but the intent is lost in practice. Second, scholars have also critiqued new urbanism for its weak basis in social science evidence. At the center of this dispute is the ability of physical and architectural design to shape social life. As Tallinn puts it, physical design need not create sense of community, but rather it can increase its probability. New urbanism has thus far not been widely adopted in India, though some of its elements such as transit-oriented development are increasingly part of policymakers' toolkits. Early urban planning in India attempted to apply Western solutions to Indian problems. Responding to the public health concerns produced by industrialization and overcrowding, it sought to secure the European city from the hazards of the native settlements in colonial centers such as Calcutta and Mumbai. To this paradigm, Patrick Geddes, a Scottish sociologist, ecologist, and urban planner, offered a bracing antidote. Geddes' contribution lay in recognizing the vibrant tradition and artifacts of pre-colonial Indian cities and for placing the historic core at the very heart of the urban planning program. Instead of town planning, Geddes preferred the term city design, an approach that traced its lineage less from engineering, sanitation, or architecture and more from the natural and social sciences. Geddes was a pioneer in many areas, and as Munshi notes, in addition to the nearly 40 city reports he produced during his 10-year sojourn in India, he was also the founder of urban sociology in the country. A regional perspective was also a piece of with Geddes' holistic vision. In a town planning approach influenced by social ecology, Geddes sought to understand the many interrelated factors, that is housing, employment, air quality, water supply, the availability of gardens or natural areas, and the nature of cultural identity that entered into the sum of human health. The region as a unit of study occupied a special place in Geddes' thinking and was realized through a regional survey framework attempted to understand the ecological linkages between the hamlets, villages, towns, and cities. Some of these ideas were taken up and elaborated by Indian scholars such as Radha Kamal Mukherjee. In a reconfiguring colonial vision of the planned city, Geddes introduced a a number of methodological innovations. Most important of these was the diagnostic or civic survey, which aimed to provide a feel for the history, economics, and unique culture of each city and its organic form. In contrast to the contemporary town planning practices, Geddes advised that the laying out of streets always be preceded by an analysis of the local needs and potentialities. A second element of Geddes' approach was conservative surgery, that is, an emphasis on minimizing demolition and disruption and reining in human and financial costs of urban development. Where lane widening would go, Geddes recommended against laying streets. If the removal of a few of the worst buildings could help improve insanitary conditions, he argued against the wholesale demolition and the improvement trust initiatives of the type favored by the colonial planners. Underlying these mainstays of Geddes' planning method was a deep respect for the manifestation of tradition in the Indian city. The Parda garden as a site of a gender-segregated public space, the Chabutra for neighborhood sociability, the Tulsi plant as the centerpiece of Indian home. During his time in India, Geddes' unusual ideas often left him bared from the most prestigious colonial planning projects. His first major commission was given by the Calcutta municipality, a partially elected body, to produce a plan for Bara Bazar, a diverse mixed-use native area comprising a variant of narrow streets, shop, godown, residences, and bastis. A highly priced site of real estate, the bazaar was in the crosshairs of the demolitions planned by numerous government administrations over the 19th and 20th century. He began his work with a comprehensive house-to-house survey that provided a strong empirical foundation to his final recommendation. His final report included three major departures from the official vision on Bara Bazar. First, he recommended respecting and building up the existing east-west alignment of streets in line with long-standing traffic patterns. Second, he suggested preserving the northeast as residential area and developing the southwest as a modern business district. Third, he advocated for maintaining the traditional aesthetic and urban form as a model for new redevelopment where it was required. We can notice several echoes of Geddes' vision as it was fleshed out in the Bara Bazar plan to Jacob's ideas on the city. In Lahore, Geddes stood resolutely against an improvement scheme that would have demolished temples, mosques, businesses, and houses, criticizing it for indiscriminate destruction of the whole past labor and industry of men. Most remarkable, as Datta points out, Geddes saw community life rather than spatial expense as critical to realizing the promise of open space. One can only imagine what the Indian city would have been like had Geddes' seemingly radical but eminently sensible ideas came to guide town planning in colonial and post-colonial India. Despite legitimate criticisms of the way he worked, Geddes has proved a highly influential thinker, and his views of the city region as the city on an organism was subsequently assimilated and elaborated upon both in India and in the West by disciples such as Radhakamal Mukherjee and Louis Mumford. Despite the imaginative scope and geographic expanse of Geddes' body of work, it left relatively little mark on post-colonial urban planning in India. Instead, the knowledge edifice for urban planning in India continued to privilege the application of Western town planning models to Indian conditions. Menon shows, for example, the extent to which a widely used Public Works Department handbook of town planning into the 1970s and beyond continued uncritically derive planning precepts from Harvard's Garden City. There were, however, some exceptions to such wholesale and mindless import of Western paradigms. Let us look at the modernism in the Indian cities and how it had unfolded. So, what should the city look like in Indian city? What should the city look like in independent India? Was a question that exercised the imaginations of policymakers in post-independence India. Unfettered by tradition, was French architect Le Corbusier modernist response built into the iconic state capital of Chandigarh. Cities such as Chandigarh, Bhubaneswar, and lastly Gandhinagar may represent the heyday of modernist architecture and urban planning in India, but the legacy of the paradigm has continued to shape the aesthetic of Indian cities into the present. Kalia argues, however, that the new state capitals, including Chandigarh, exemplified the outcomes of a more varied set of influences and ideas. Architects and planners in Gandhinagar, for instance, were torn between the unadorned appeal of modernism and need to embody Indianness through traditional iconography. Indeed, the neighborhood unit was to become a key element of the modernist achievement of the trifecta of new state capitals Chandigarh, Bhubaneswar, and Gandhinagar. Let us look how the neighborhood unit has worked in Indian context. The neighborhood unit was brought into India in the 1940s by planners such as Otto Königsberg in his plan for an industrial development in Mysore princely state. However, the neighborhood unit's resounding popularity in very different social and economic contexts of post-colonial India owed itself to a confluence of latent ideas. Most importantly, the appeal of the neighborhood unit reflected in part the tremendous resonance of the British civil lines, which was identified as wide roads, gracious bungalows, and so on. Though the post-independence civil lines were no longer home to racially segregated European quarters, their spatial design elements represented a decisive break from the aesthetic and from the indigenous Indian city. This aspiration to an urban spatiality uncontaminated by the vestiges of the vernacular or indigenous also arose from the class and caste origins of the urban elites. These Western educated elites, concentrated in modern secondary and tertiary sectors, had little contact with or interest in rural or urban informal India. Moreover, their high caste social bases bred an aversion for the chaotic, vital, and unhygienic social spaces of the indigenous. Some Western planners, such as Königsberger, did make a good faith effort to overcome some of the fragmentation inherent in the neighborhood unit by designing Bhubaneswar neighborhoods to include a mix of social and professional groups. Similarly, Mayer's early plan for Chandigarh sought to reproduce the vitality of the bazaar in the shopping centers of the neighborhood units. Despite these variant attempts, the adoption of neighborhood unit in Indian cities often followed a one-size-fits-all template. The Delhi Master Plan that was prepared in 1962, and this was prepared by a team of young planners trained in the West, drew upon and indigenized the neighborhood unit by translocating it into the mohalla. At the same time, Delhi Master Plan operationalized Paris' original instance of self-containment to a hierarchy of geographic scales in the city. Planning discourse, pedagogy, and standardization of planning practices helped the assimilation and institutionalization of neighborhood unit in India, because in some ways the planning paradigm was perceived to be a universally modern, readily and eminently transferable across cultural contexts. However, by 21st century, the neighborhood unit plan for Jaipur had been fully appropriated, hybridized, and converted into mixed-use spaces, producing a distinct form of urbanism. In this sense, it can be said that the evolution of the neighborhood in India conforms to the processes of diversification and densification underlined by Jacobs and to unique genius of Indian urbanism celebrated by Geddes. So students, let us now summarize what we have learned in this module. So this module has surveyed planning paradigms that have influenced or resonated with the physical, social, and economic form of contemporary Indian society, Indian city. While the models provided by the Garden City movement, Modernism, and the neighborhood unit have entered the professional toolkits of Indian planners, others such as those of Geddes or Jacobs remain little known or little embraced. Banerjee and Bayer's analysis of the values carried by the neighborhood unit concept offers a tantalizing explanation about the factors that determine the mobility of planning paradigms. These includes contextual values, the intellectual concerns and thinking that underpins a planning paradigm. For example, the need to combat the effects of industrialization on agriculture and public health informed Harvard's Garden City program. The second cluster consists of embodied values, such as the practitioner's concerns about creating a physical space to provide opportunities for leisure, recreation, and social interaction, and an environment that is safe, protected, pleasing, and secure, often captured in physical plans. The third set comprises tacit values, which represent the unstated social assumption of the gender relations, caste and class practices, etc., that form the substratum of a planning paradigm. The adoption of the neighborhood unit by Indian planners was made possible through a rupture between its constituent context, manifest, and tacit values. It could be argued that such a break could not be accomplished for the ideas of Jacobs or even Geddes, given that their methods depended on rigorous empirical observation and context specificity. However, buttressing such an argument must remain on the agenda for future scholarship. And an incisive dissection of the town planning imagination in India, Menon argues that planning practices have ascribed to British models a hallowed universality. Urban planning in India, meanwhile, remains derivative. The reliance on physical planning templates provided by the garden city or neighborhood unit paradigms is stripped of their social and physical context, and that has also led to an anti-urban stance in Indian planners' approach to densification and diversity. To reform planning practices in a direction more attuned to the realities of Indian cities, we require an overhaul not only of planning paradigms and pedagogies, but also of how town planners view and understand the city. So it is worth asking towards the end, how would the aesthetic and function of the Indian city be transformed if planners like Jacobs or Geddes paid attention to its organic dynamics and informal logic? That is an urbanism worth imagining. Thank you.